Okay, so I wanted to discuss a little bit about Resolution 46/1, and in particular, how is this relevant to Tamils seeking a right to self-determination, and sort of what avenues do we have to seek international acknowledgement of our very existence as an independent state, let alone receiving international protection from our oppressor. There can be no expression of identity without the freedom of language, speech, and religion, and recognition and retribution of past genocide. All for these decades have been stifled by the Sri Lankan government. So last year in January 21, in what was a major setback for Sri Lanka, the United Nations Human Rights Council adopted a resolution against Colombo's record on human rights. At least 22 of the 47 member nations, including the UK, Canada, and Germany, all voted in favour of Resolution 46/1, and 11 voted against the resolution. This was Bangladesh, China, Pakistan, and Russia. 14 countries abstained from voting, which include Nepal and India. India has not only abstained, but has also urged Sri Lanka to carry out the process of reconciliation and engage with the international community and address the aspiration of its brethren Tamil community. So under the UNHCR resolution, the Sri Lankan government was required to ensure an impartial investigation into all human rights crimes. The UNHCR would enhance its monitoring of the situation in Sri Lanka. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights would advise and assist the Sri Lankan government to implement these suggestions and then present an update at the Council's 48th session. It was titled Promotion of Reconciliation, Accountability and Human Rights in Sri Lanka, and this resolution 46/1 had called upon Colombo to ensure a thorough, independent and non-biased investigation into all crimes related to human rights violation. For the sake of context, the calls for this new Resolution 46/1 began after the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights released his initial report on Sri Lanka in March 2021, to which the Sri Lankan government strongly and vehemently rejected the resolution, calling it divisive, and in particularly rejecting the presence of the Office of the High Commissioner overseeing the completion of the resolution, citing that it violates the principles of sovereign equality of all states and non-interference of internal affairs. So Sri Lanka has a long history of delaying and bypassing UNHCR resolutions. It's important to remember that in 2020, the Rajapaksa government had unilaterally withdrawn from Resolution 30/1 in what was at the time a very clear rejection of human rights and accountability, displaying again total disregard for the UNHCR, for its member states, and for the international community. And we as Tamils anticipate that this Resolution 46/1 will be enacted with the same degree of resistance. So UNHCR High Commissioner delivered a follow-up report in February of this year on progress, and nothing has changed. So in his 22 report, the High Commissioner writes, warning that Sri Lanka remains at as high a risk as ever of human rights violations being repeated, and in fact continue on today. The 2022 report talks about the persistent militarization of governmental function and positions, persistence of singular ethno-nationalist rhetoric with attempts to bulldoze religious and cultural beliefs of Sri Lanka's Tamils and Muslim community, including attempting to enforce the forced cremation law for COVID deceased, which in particular would impact the Muslim community, and President Gotabaya Rajapaksa's 2019 ban on Tamil commemorations of the war dead. He tried to enforce this with military officials disrupting ceremonies and arresting or beating journalists for media coverage of ceremonies. The report talks about the continued intimidation of the civil society and Tamil journalists, deaths in custody of Tamil journalists and pro-Tamil civilians, continued intimidation of widows, mothers, and family of former LTTE, the willful ignorance of the Sri Lankan government and international bodies to the extrajudicial execution of surrendered prisoners of war, the selective escape of liability for government and military officials themselves accused by the international body of serious war crimes, including former commander of the Sri Lankan Army, General Shavendra Silva, Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa, and President Gotabaya Rajapaksa. The Rajapaksa brothers have consolidated a hold on the country with a landslide victory in the recent elections by Mahinda Rajapaksa. So their powers continue to grow, including waiving off term limits for the president, tight control over the police force and the judiciary. So diplomats among the Sri Lankan government and within the Sri Lankan army are inexplicably linked and directly responsible for the execution of at least 100,000 Tamil civilians during the escalation of the 2009 conflict, tens of thousands of enforced disappearances, and this will continue with impunity. The ongoing intimidation of Tamils today, with military occupying Tamil land to this date. So, with respect to the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, requesting that the Sri Lankan government impartially investigate war crime allegations now 14 years after the fact, this is asking the Sri Lankan government to investigate itself. The Sri Lankan government has repeatedly demonstrated complete disregard for UNHCR resolutions and outright rejected Resolution 40/1. Thus, it is absurd to expect Tamils or the international community to rely on domestic mechanisms for reconciliation when there has existed for decades a significant power imbalance at a societal, political, governmental, and even educational level. It's long gone beyond an internal issue. Any international truth-seeking mechanisms for Tamils is continuing to be decades delayed. Tamils calling for an independent state of Tamil-Eelam are left wondering why the tens of thousands of our Tamil deaths seem to be sidelined by international bodies. If I draw a comparison to what's happening in the Ukraine currently, UNHCR announced motion to refer Putin's government of Russia straight to the International Criminal Court for attacks on the nation of the Ukraine within 5 days of hostilities commencing, 550 Ukrainian civilian deaths and rising Ukrainian civilian morbidity, with 24-hour mainstream media coverage of the situation. So I ask, does Tamil-Eelam need to be formally recognised on the European stage as an independent state prior to UNHCR and Europe as our only international peacekeeping body taking any kind of practical affirmative action in our direction? Tamils empathise strongly with the Ukrainian people as the oppressed under a tyrant, but we have also been in crisis for decades, with unilateral Sinhalese subjugation within our own country. This was preceded by decades of a colonial oppressor. We urgently demand long overdue international intervention for the execution of at least 100,000 plus Tamil civilians, tens of thousands of enforced disappearances, and ongoing discrimination against Tamils by the government of Sri Lanka. The government of Sri Lanka, which has now repeatedly flat out rejected UNHCR resolutions, must be tried in the International Criminal Court and tried now for gross human rights abuses, and these have spanned decades. Culprit government officials Mahinda and Gotabaya Rajapaksa trialled appropriately as war criminals by non-biased and, more importantly, non-domestic mechanisms. Only then can our centuries-old race, our culture, our language and religion have a hope of survival.